Please give a warm welcome to Starhawk. Starhawk is an author, activist, and permaculture designer and teacher, and a prominent voice in the modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism. She's the author or co-author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, City of Refuge. Her most recent nonfiction book is The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups on group dynamics, power, conflict, and communications. Starhawk founded Earth Activist Training, teaching permaculture design grounded in spirituality and with a focus on activism. She travels internationally, lecturing and teaching on earth-based spirituality, the tools of ritual, and skills of activism. She will be speaking to us today on her topic, why we need to envision a hopeful future. Please take it away, Starhawk.
Thank you. And hello, everybody. Good morning. I am speaking to you today. I actually am in Canada, on Vancouver Island, on the traditional lands of the Cowichan people. Although I live in San Francisco, which was anciently called Yelamu, the land of the Ramaytush Ohlone. And I'm grateful to have heard that beautiful land acknowledgement and to have learned something more of the history of Canada, which I don't know as well as I do the US. But it seems that every land here has both a history of colonization and also a history of tremendous resilience and creativity and traditions of culture and art, of dance, of ceremony, of just beautiful crafts, and of really skillful tending and caring for the land. And it is my hope that as people who write about and envision a future, that the work we do can in some way take up some of that tradition of caring and tending for the land and for the community. Because to me, writing, and especially writing solar punk, writing about the future and writing about the future in ways that are hopeful, are ways of actually tending and caring for our community. And while it's a lot of fun to do and fun to read, it's more than that. I think it can actually be a healing practice. So to say that I was writing, I wrote a book called The Fifth Sacred Thing. It came out in 1993, but I was writing it throughout the early 80s. I've written a sequel to it called City of Refuge that I wrote about 20 years later. And for me, part of the work of writing it came out of the idea of I was doing all this activism. We were protesting nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We were standing up against US intervention in Latin America. We were doing work to protect the old growth forests and to stop nuclear testing at the Nevada test site. And in doing that, we really developed a whole political culture that was based on people getting together and making decisions together and not having a top-down kind of leadership, but actually forming our mobilizations and our actions out of small groups we called affinity groups that made decisions by consensus, that practiced a powerful form of horizontal democracy, and that then made decisions for the actions. And I started to ask myself, what would the world look like if we really based all of culture on these same principles, on coming together and respecting each person's voice and making decisions and making choices together? And that was where I created the whole world of the Fifth Sacred Thing, and the positive parts, at least. For me, that was personally healing, It was healing in the sense that we're surrounded often by systems and by structures that don't value us at our core, that tell us we have to compete, we have to scrabble hard to gain any kind of value at all. And envisioning a world where people were simply valued for being who they are. As I think in many indigenous cultures, there are traditions, there are rituals, there are ways of truly seeing and valuing each person. That for me was a healing process. But I think that it's a process also to envision a positive future that can be healing on a larger scale. And so I was very grateful because I was writing all this stuff long before there was a genre for it. And because of that, my books never quite fit, into, they weren't exactly science fiction, they weren't exactly fantasy, they weren't exactly futuristic fiction. There wasn't much else like them except for a few books like Ecotopia. But having an actual genre and having people who are interested in and dedicated to envisioning a positive future, I think can be healing also on a cultural level. Because if you look around, you'll notice that not much of what we portray about the future is very positive. If you watch the movies or whatever, it's all Mad Max, it's American Civil War, it's disaster. And, there's a reason for that, that as humans, we tend to get our attention grabbed, right? When we get our nervous system activated by adrenaline and fight or flight and danger and things that threaten us on a survival level. But there is a magical teaching that says kind of what you envision, what you have in your mind is where your energy flows. And where your energy flows is what you manifest. You can think about this on a very practical level. Like maybe you woke up this morning, you wanted a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, right? You have to have in your mind an image of yourself drinking that cup of tea. You have to have in your mind an image of how you're going to heat that water. Do you have an electric kettle? Do you heat it up on the stove? Right? You have to envision getting the cup, and all those things in your mind direct your energy to manifest your body moving around and making that cup of tea. You can't make a cup of tea by lying there in bed going, I really don't want a cup of coffee. Or thinking about the worst thing you've ever drunk and how horrible it is. You have to envision what you want. And if you think about it, like all of this negative picturing of the future, in some ways, it's almost like casting a spell that says, this is what we're going to get. This is what we have in our minds. This is all we envision in our minds. And that's in some ways where our energy is flowing. I'm not saying no one should ever write disturbing fiction. In my books, there are positive visions and negative ones because part of the job of fiction, and I think especially futuristic fiction, is to warn. But if we don't counter that with any kind of vision of hope or possibility, then we don't have any way to direct that energy into something that might bring a more positive future about. And so in that sense, I think the work of solar punk is tremendously important. And that the more that we can actually provide for people some kind of vision, some kind of image of what could be, or what we might want to be, Uh, Again, it's a powerful act of cultural healing. To be effective, that image has to be as clear as possible, as clear and as detailed. And I think that is another benefit of envisioning a positive future, is that the work of envisioning is that it's real work. If you do it well, and those of you who write know this, it takes a lot of time and a lot of thought to actually build a world. Because to make it work in fiction, you have to really think out every aspect of it. You have to really carefully imagine every piece of it, or it doesn't have that sense of reality. And in fact, the more complex your visualization is, I think the more reality it has, the more people fall into it, and the more power it has to move people emotionally. So what does that work feel like? Let's practice. Like, take a deep breath right now. Close your eyes. Take some deep breaths into your belly. I'd like you to think about a place that you know. Maybe it's a room in your house. Maybe it's your garden. Maybe it's a place you like to go in nature. If you take a moment, imagine yourself walking into this place. Look around you. Notice what you see. Take a deep sniff in the air. What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you sense? How do you feel in this place? Turn and face the east, whatever that feels like for you. If you don't know exactly which way is east, just pick one direction. What's there? If it's a room, are there objects? Is there dust on those objects? Are they shiny? If it's outdoors somewhere, is there a plant? Is there a flower, a tree, branch? Reach out, touch something. How does the texture feel? Take a deep sniff in. Can you smell this thing? You can put it down, turn to the next direction. Again, look around, notice what's there. Are there blank spaces? Are there things you don't notice? Can't remember? And turn to the west. And what's there in the west? How about the north? And coming back to the center, maybe think about one object you've seen there. How would you describe it? Is there emotion, a feeling that it evoked for you? Can you describe it in a way that awakens some of that same feeling? And just take a breath and bring yourself back. Let yourself be wherever you are right now. And just think about that as an exercise. You know, it's a kind of exercise I've done a lot in terms of magical training and teaching, just developing that ability to visualize and hold that image in your mind. It's a very useful image for writers, an exercise for writers, because, again, the more that you can create a sense of reality for your readers, the more vivid and the more alive your work is going to be. And for those of you who are readers but not writers who might be on this conference, I think it's also a useful exercise in terms of thinking about what you do want and what we do want, what kind of world we want. There's a saying by the poet William Carlos Williams, no ideas but in things, which means not abstractions in poetry. You know, you don't talk about love as an abstraction. You have some kind of central image, some kind of real object, something that represents the feeling, the emotion, the type of love. You know, maybe it's a latte in the Sunday New York Times, right? Maybe it's a juicy mango on the beach in Hawaii, whatever it is. That is what evokes emotion in us, whereas just naming an emotion doesn't do it so well. And so the work of writing and envisioning that future, if you really put the work into it and envision it clearly, it means that you have to flesh out that world. And to flesh out that world, you have to understand how it works. And if you really understand how it works, you kind of give us a blueprint for how the world could work. And you counter all the voices in our culture that say, there is no alternative, you know, there is no possibility other than what we have. When we start to try to make political change, when we try to really make deep cultural change, it's very vital that we have at least a vision of something big and beautiful and transformative that could be. You know, we often settle for what, not what we should get done, but what we can get done. And that's okay. That's kind of how it works. It's better than not getting anything done. But it's important that we have a bigger vision so that we know what we are heading to and what we want to shape the world towards. And again, to me, that is part of the healing work of envisioning a positive future. The other thing that this kind of writing and visioning can do is it allows us to kind of create thought experiments. And for me, fiction is never something like, it should never be didactic. You know, it should never be, I know the answer, I know how this should be, and therefore I'm going to tell everybody. I often do feel like I know the answer, and when I do, I write nonfiction. But when I write fiction, it's often because I have a question that I don't know how to answer. There's a whole school of theory about complexity. It says like, things in life, some things are clear, right? You know, your sink is leaking, right? And you look underneath and you see that the trap is leaking, and it's clear that you need to turn off the water, replace it, put in a new thing, and that will fix it. Right? Clear is when you know the answer. Some things are complicated. You know, complicated is when your sink is leaking, your water's not working, you look down there and you don't know the answer. And you can't figure it out. You got so many pipes, you have no idea. You have to call in an expert. You have to call in a plumber, somebody who can figure that out. The plumber traces it, looks through all the pipes, has the expertise and the knowledge to figure out what's wrong and to fix it. But there is still an answer. There is something that can be fixed. Some things are chaotic. Suddenly the water's spurting everywhere. You don't know what's going on, and all you can do in that situation is you got to do something to stop it. You got to go find that place where you can turn all the water off before it floods the living room. And you just have to quickly take action. But some things are complex. And when things are complex, it's often not something like your plumbing. It's something like a living system, where there are so many parts that are interacting and impacting each other that there is no simple cause and effect. There is no one right, clear answer. And all you can do is try things out and experiment. Well, solar punk, this process of writing and envisioning positive future is a way to deal with complexity, because it allows us to try out different answers. They say with complexity, you want to try it out in a way that's safe to fail. So if your question is like, why aren't my cattle thriving? You might try them in different small feedlots for short periods of time to see if they improve. You don't want to risk killing off your entire herd by making some drastic change you haven't tested. Well, with solar punk, it's a safe to fail way of experimenting with different futures. And that's where those questions come in. For me, when I wrote The Fifth Sacred Thing, the question I was wrestling with is, can a peaceful society that's based on all of these beautiful principles and values people, and it's based on democracy, can it survive if it's faced with conquest and violence? And that question for me actually rose out of historical research I had been doing for many years on the transition from a matrifocal, female-oriented, life-oriented culture at the roots of civilization in the Middle East and in Europe to a patriarchal, war-based culture. It was inevitable once people start killing each other and conquering each other that everyone has to transform in relationship to war, which means transform into systems that are domination-based and power over, or is there a way to resist? And so, in some ways, the Fifth Sacred Thing was one giant thought experiment. When I wrote City of Refuge 20 years later, I was heavily influenced by the Occupy movement. And the 2011. And the question I was really wrestling with there was a very different one. It was the question of how do we build the new world when people are so deeply damaged by the old? And so I encourage you in your writing, if you think you know something, if you have like a an agenda that you want to put forth, build that into the background of the world itself, rather than making it the center of your book or your writing. In the fifth sacred thing, again, all the stuff I thought I knew and all the values I had, I tried to build them into the world of the North, Northern California. And that part was a lot of fun. Walking around the streets of San Francisco saying, well, how would this be different? Well, I could get rid of that ugly building, but I'm going to keep those beautiful old Victorians. It's a wonderful sense of power and omnipotence. When you're a writer, you just change the world by changing a few words. But let the heart of your writing center around a question you don't know the answer to, because that will give it some life and keep it alive for you through that tremendous amount of work it takes to actually write something and pull it together. Your world doesn't have to be the same as this world. It can have radically different rules and laws. Things can work differently in it, but it has to be consistent with itself. Whatever rule you set up, either for yourself or for the world, you have to kind of stick to it. Again, the fifth sacred thing, because I wanted to envision a world that had really gone beyond racism, or at least a part of it, where that wasn't a factor, I made it a point not to describe anyone in terms of a race, not to say anyone was white or black or Asian, but to actually describe how they looked. And I spend a lot of time riding around on buses staring at people, probably making them deeply uncomfortable, kind of going like, how exactly would I describe the tone of their skin if I'm not gonna call them African American? I don't want to use cafe au lait because that's a cliche. Like, is it brown of a hazelnut or a walnut? But if you do that kind of work, again, it'll give your writing life. And again, if you do that kind of work, if you're an activist, if you're planning something you want to do, even if you're building a new garden, creating a new garden, or building a room in your house, and you carefully think out, what are the rules I want for myself here? Maybe you want to say, I'm going to build a garden where every single part of it is easily accessible to somebody who is a little bit older and can't walk that well. Then that will give you a structure and a form that's going to be consistent, and that's going to actually create it in a way that gives it a kind of uniqueness and a beauty of its own. And again, when we do that in solar punk, I think a lot of what we can do is envision different possibilities and then play them out and see, do they work or do they not work? Especially if you do that work of envisioning them in detail, really thinking out how they could work, how one change might impact every other change. In the fifth sacred thing, and also City of Refuge, for example, in the South, in the dystopian parts, they have all of these soldiers who are sort of bred and raised as disposable fighting units, and they don't have names, they just have numbers. And thinking about that, then you can go into that more deeply and think, well, if I have a character who's one of these soldiers, what would it feel like? What would it feel like to have someone give you a name? How would that shift and change who you are? Would there be some spark of common humanity that you could reach in spite of all of this conditioning? What kind of change might that spur for someone? And it's asking those kind of questions will lead you to characters, I think, that are richer and more complex and deeper and more exciting. And so, again, if you're world building, think of that as a chance to try out some of these different possibilities and see how they work. There are things that will work and things that won't work. When I was writing Fifth Sacred Thing originally, I really wanted Maya, who's one of the central characters, who's 98 years old in the book. I really wanted her to have a wild affair, right, with one of the younger characters, and it just wouldn't work. I could not even convince myself, not that the younger character wouldn't go for it, but that she would actually have any real interest in someone who was 60 years younger than herself. So sometimes that thought experiment will tell you what not to do, and sometimes it will open up whole new possibilities and potentials. And finally, I think one of the important reasons we need to envision a positive future is to give people hope. Right now, we are living in a time when I think a lot of people are very despairing about the future. And certainly if you're in the United States, our current political moment is one that really is not conducive to lots of hope and optimism. But people aren't mobilized to make change from despair. Despair makes people give up, retreat, go back into their own private little worlds. And to make change, and to make change on a cultural and a complex level, we need to have hope. We need to, again, have not just a vision of where we want to go, but some kind of real hope and energy that we could get there. And I think that's one of the most important, one of the key healing potentials in solar punk is that it can give people a sense of hope. And again, it does that by envisioning a future, holding that vision, fleshing that vision out, making it as real as it can be, and making people want it. If you can see that vision of the world, if you can feel it, if you can live in it for a time, as you do when you're reading something, then maybe you really, really want it. And you remember like some years back when the first Avatar came out, and people loved that vision of the world so much that there were people like started dressing in blue and going around like, you want to make people really want that world. And again, you do that not just by making it pretty, but by making it real with complexity, with conflict, with flaws. It's kind of like if you want to serve someone a dinner, you don't just serve them the dessert. You want to serve them the whole thing. And they're going to like some parts of it better than others. But they're going to get more nourishment than if you just serve them, the cakes and the ice cream. So those are some of the reasons I think we need a vision of a positive future. And we need fiction, we need writing that creates that vision. But I also think that vision is most effective when it's not like kind of slammed in your face, right? When it becomes the world your characters move in, and you allow your characters to embody not just what you think you already know, but again, those questions that you don't know. And you allow them to take on a reality of their own. Because those questions get answered, I think, most effectively when they're answered by the choices that the characters make and wrestle with. Again, not by your imposing what you think they ought to do or say, where they aren't mouthing your values or giving speeches about them, but they're really wrestling again with the dilemma of what does this pose for me, right? If the question is how do we resist violence without becoming violent, each character in the fifth sacred thing kind of has to answer that question for themselves in a different way and go through a different struggle. And even though a lot of people have looked at the book and think of it as promoting nonviolence, really speaking for nonviolence, and some of the characters really do very strongly and kind of embody that. I don't think of it that way. I don't think of it as this is a definitive answer about how you should struggle. I like to think of it that each character, again, struggles with that question in their own way, with their own moral dilemmas and their own sometimes extremely painful choices. And out of that, comes a resolution in terms of the book itself. But in doing that, I think you give readers an opportunity to wrestle with those questions as well, and not just to respond to what you think about it, but to really take them in and be asking themselves, how would I make this choice? And I think that is, again, an important healing work that fiction can do, because without it, we have many, many fewer opportunities in our culture to actually struggle with uncertainty and admit complexity. And we live in a world where everybody seems instantly certain about everything, right? You go on the internet and something happens and suddenly everybody has an opinion that they strongly hold to. And nobody ever admits, I don't really know how to deal with this. And yet so many of the questions we're dealing with are so complex that we don't really know. And exploring them through this process of world building and creating can be a way of opening that up for us. But to do that and to make that alive as a work of fiction, again, your characters kind of have to come alive for you. If you're really writing, I think some of you will find that this happens, that you've got this whole internal world going of these characters you talk to and they talk to you, and sometimes you want to get them to do certain things, they won't do it. Sometimes they do things and you're like, oh, you shouldn't do that. You're going to regret that. And they go ahead and do it anyway. If they take on that kind of reality for you as a writer, then they can take on that kind of reality for the reader as well. And it's going to give your work much more life and depth than if your characters are more wooden representations of your ideology. And I look back at my own writing and I'll say some of it, mostly I think my main characters do that a lot. There are some minor characters where I go, well, this one really does a good job of expressing these ideas, but doesn't really wrestle with them much herself or himself. Change. And I think as I do more writing, that might try to work that more for all of the characters in the books. Solar punk is also a great way of just exploring lots of different possibilities. And after the Fifth Sacred Thing, the things I've written more recently, to be honest, I'm not so much writing fiction right now. I'm writing a nonfiction book on movement building and how we create change. It's called The Movement We Need, and I'm experimenting with a whole different way of doing it. I'm putting it out on Substack, chapter by chapter as I write it, because I feel like it needs to be out there now, not like a couple of years from now. But when I'm done with that, I hope to go back to writing. I started to write a series of stories that were really exploring the question, what would happen if we thought about gender completely differently than we do? What would happen if gender was a verb instead of a noun? If we thought of it as something we do rather than something we are and identify with? And what would a culture be like if what would parent-child relationships be like if you've got children who grew up in this completely liberated world and you've got parents who are still shaped by the old world? So I wrote a story for Solar Punk magazine called The Brave Dress, where you had a parent who had come out of the old world, who's basically trans and had suffered deeply for being gender nonconforming, and had this prom dress she desperately wanted her child to wear, and the child comes out of this world where gender just isn't really a thing. And they have this argument about what she's going to wear to the ceremony, the life-changing ceremony when they reach adulthood and transform from a young student to someone who's a contributing member of society. It was interesting how it turned out for me, because in spite of changing all of the factors in the world and the stuff around it, the actual central conflict was so much like arguments I'd had with my own mother Oh, how deeply she wanted me to have a sweet 16 party, and how I thought that was just the lamest and like stupidest thing I'd ever heard of. Now I can look back on it and go, oh, she wanted me to have a sweet 16 party because she never had one. I can feel a lot more tenderness and compassion. But at the time, it was like, oh my God, she's so lame. Nah. And so I think, again, when we can use our world building skills um, to create, again, these possibilities and these potentials, and then play out human conflicts and things that are very relatable to everybody because they are the same kinds of conflicts that happen over and over and over again in life and in the world. So, just to sum up, I think there are a number of different reasons why we really need positive visions of the future. The first is because we ain't going to get anything unless we can actually envision it and imagine it. That's what directs our energies. That's what guides us in moving towards it. And so we desperately need some positive images of a future that we actually want. The second is that if we do that work of really envisioning what that future looks like in detail, bringing it alive, it creates a richness and a texture in our writing. But again, it also really helps with that direction of the energy. It makes it real for the reader, and it can make the reader really want it, desire it, mobilize some energy towards going to get it. Then it's also a way that we can create thought experiments around some of these issues that are so complex that there's no safe way to play them out in reality, but we can play them out in our imagination and envision a wide range and spectrum of alternatives and really activate our imagination, and that can spark other people to envision alternatives and help us find directions in what we can do back in the real world. And finally, it's a way that we can stimulate hope and optimism, energize people, make people, again, really, really want that positive future and find their own ways to move forward and work towards getting it. So I have left some time here for questions and for discussion, and I'd like to open it up for that now.
I believe that Bright Flame actually messaged me during your talk to mention a question that they had of, I'd love her to talk about Earth activist training, how it came to be, the intention, and how it spread.
Thanks, Bright Flame. I just want to say Bright Flame's going to be speaking later. She has a wonderful new book coming out called The Working, and I hope you'll all check it out and read it. It's a very magical book. I guess for me, Earth activist training is sort of the practical end of all of this envisioning. It's the permaculture trainings that we do that teach. Permaculture is a whole system of ecological design and planning, and we teach it with a grounding in spirit and a focus on organizing and activism. So I'm just actually this week beginning a 2-week-long permaculture design course up here at a place called Our Eco Village in Shawnigan Lake, British Columbia. But we do in-person courses, and we also do a lot of courses online, both the permaculture design course, but we also do a lot of training in what we call social permaculture, which is how do we apply the principles we understand from ecology, from nature, the way nature works. What if we actually applied them to looking at our human systems and how we get along with each other? So I invite you all to check it out at earthactivisttraining.org, because if you have visions of the future and you want some of the practical tools for making it real, it's a great system to learn. We have an advanced training that's a multi-year program that takes people and gives them really this whole set of skills and tools and understanding you need for regenerative land management, to take a piece of damaged land and bring it back to life and health and manage it effectively. I'll also say we have an organization called Reclaiming, which is more our spiritual network. Bright Flame and I are both part of that. That teaches creating ritual and ceremony with a basis in the earth and the ancient goddess traditions from before patriarchy, or at least from what we can remember reconstruct of them. And there are different groups all over the place that do that. And for me, that's been a big influence on how I envision the world. I think there's many important reasons that people need a sense of ritual and magic in your life. Partly because it's a very positive way that people can come together and feel like you belong to something, and partly because it has many tools for our personal and collective healing. So those are some resources that are available to y'all if you're interested.
In order of kind of the time we've gotten with them, we have one from Eric Boyd. Can you speak about the sort of human obsession with conflict? It's so much easier to write about something negative and it gets such a larger engagement, but what we need most is positive visions for the future. How do you think about how to make positive visions more engaging, or conversely, how to avoid focusing on the negative?
I think we are, as humans, attuned to conflict. It's probably something kind of hardwired into us. Conflict, it just sets up all of this stuff in our nervous system, the fight, the flight, the adrenaline, the hormones, So the question is, what do we do with that? What I did with it in the fifth sacred thing was the conflict was between the positive and the negative visions. So that's one thing that you can do with it. It is true, we can't just write pretty pictures of the positive future. I mean, we can, right? But they aren't tremendously engaging. But the other thing is that the conflict doesn't have to be fighting and warlike. The conflict is simply competing desires or competing visions. And it doesn't have to be a hostile conflict. It could be the conflict between, like, the mother who really wants her daughter to wear this dress that's so significant to her, and the daughter who's like, are you kidding? That's the lamest thing I've ever heard. I want to wear something that reflects me. It doesn't have to be about force and violence. It can be about competing wishes, goals, desires, values, like it often is in life. I mean, in most of our groups and organizations, conflict is not uh, you're good and I'm evil, or I'm good and you're evil. It's about, I look at the world this way and you look at the world that way. And I think that's one potential thing we can do as writers, and as writers envision the future, is model people who actually wrestle with conflicts, but don't frame them as, I have to destroy my enemy. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you, Starhawk. Our next question is coming over from the Discord. It's from Laura K. Is the solar punk movement too much focused on technology at the moment?
I don't really know how to answer that, but I think that it's important to say that technology is one of the ways we can envision a positive future, but it's not the only way, and maybe not the most important way. And this may be my bent as a writer and a person, whatever, but I think it's the human technology, what we call the social permaculture. How do we organize our groups? How do we understand how to work together as people? That's always the limiting factor in any kind of social change, is how the hell do people actually get along with each other? And I think that is a really rich area for exploring. And again, if you are really interested in the technology, see if it can be the background rather than the foreground. You know, let your characters wrestle with real human problems in a technologically changed world rather than the technology being the center of the story.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next one is coming from Zoom. Kwamatalk, you said earlier that when writing agendas into work, this should be done into the world and not into the book. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, that when when you really have a strong opinion about something, try to build it into the world that you create. Like in that story about the brave dress, I was really interested in questions about how do we regenerate grasslands. I teach permaculture. How do we use grazing to restore our grasslands and sequester carbon and bring it out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil? And but I didn't think a story about like soil carbon sequestration was necessarily going to be that gripping fictional drama. So I created that as the background. The story takes place in a culture of what I called the Rories, the religious order of regenerators, who basically are nomads that travel around through the damaged lands and take over a piece of land, regenerate it, bring it back to life with grazing techniques we use in permaculture. And because of that, they're very focused on things like sheep and wool. So they're weavers and dyers, and they make these beautiful, elegant, subtle kinds of clothing. And that becomes the background for the drama, which plays out between the mother, who wants her to wear this sort of very frilly and somewhat blood-stained old prom dress, right? And the daughter, who wants to wear this beautiful weaving that she's done that's subtle and gorgeous. So try to think about it that way. If you can create that world with your answers embedded into the context, then it leaves room to have actual human drama. And again, the conflicts that can play out don't have to be about, Are we going to graze sheep or cattle right here, or restore the buffalo? That can be the background, and the conflict can be something that is just some common human drama, the way parents and children always see the world differently and have to struggle with each other about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Our next question comes from Rachel A. Rosen on Discord. You talked about the central question of the fifth sacred thing as whether a society rooted in egalitarianism could survive a conflict with a militarized hierarchical one, and also that you began not knowing the answer. Was there ever a point at which you thought that the answer might be no? And if so, how would you have created a vision that was still inspiring and hopeful?
Yeah, there were plenty of points where I thought the answer might be no. And I actually felt like when it all kind of did work out at the end, I kind of like breathed a sigh of relief. It's like, whoa, I wasn't sure that was going to happen. But I will say at the end, it's not like they triumph with complete nonviolence. They basically triumph by turning enough of the invaders against themselves that they actually fight each other. So in some sense, that may not be a complete, that's why I say the book is not necessarily a complete, manifesto for nonviolence. It's really about wrestling with the reality of that question. I don't know. I mean, I honestly don't think if the answer had been no, that it would have been inspiring. Um, it might have been, work of like, I mean, it might have been better as literature, but it's not the kind of literature I want to write of leaving people in a sense of like despair or, I probably would have had to end it with the city being destroyed, but a few people escaping to keep the hope and the vision alive, or some seed of hope for the future, something. But I just felt very grateful that in the end it was able to work out in a way that could feel like a victory.
This next question comes to you from Florencia. Hi, thanks for the talk. As a researcher turned writer, I do my best to balance narrative with extrapolated real world science. Is there an approach you prefer when it comes to fleshing out your own worlds?
Yeah, I try to, again, spend a lot of time visualizing the world. Whenever possible, I base parts of it on reality. Like in the fifth sacred thing, a lot of descriptions of the house were based on my own house. And that saves you a lot of that mental work. You don't have to go envisioning like what does the kitchen look like. You can just go take a look at it, right? So where it doesn't make a difference to the narrative, I use something that is actually real, because something that is real also has a strong sense of reality. Um, but when it comes to the characters, I try to let them have their own life and let them, again, really wrestle with choices. You build character not so much out of descriptions of who they are, but about the choices that they make and the dilemmas that they face. Um, the fifth sacred thing for me really started with this image I had in my mind of Bird, who's the young man in the story. Just saw this young man kind of coming back through the city streets, looking around, really battered and just knocked about by the world and looking about at gardens and flowers and going like, whoa, there's still life here. There's still children. Like there's still some hope here. And then I had to follow that image, go, okay, well, who is he? Where's this place he's coming back to? What's he coming back from? Right. And allow it to develop from there. So I'd say let your characters come and speak to you, and then give them choices and dilemmas to wrestle with. And that's how they come alive, and that's how you build them.
Unfortunately, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I think we have enough time for one or two more questions. But this one's coming from Alicia on the Discord. As an elder in the justice movement, what do you think particularly has helped sustain you in this work over time?
I think what has sustained me is having a community to connect with and to fall back on. Um, Having a ritual, magical community that's also aligned with activism, so that we can sustain each other. Um, Having a magical and spiritual practice where I can go to nature or go to my friends in my circle and do the practices we've learned to kind of renew hope and renew energy. And that's kind of what sustains me. And also keeping in mind, I don't always know the answers. I don't always have to know the answers. I can just know the vision and figure out how do I keep working towards that.
Thank you for answering that. Our next question comes from an anonymous attendee on Zoom. I have a question about writing. Some parts of Fifth Sacred Thing are quite intense. How, as a writer, do you cope with the emotional and psychological challenge of daring to imagine how bad it can get in order to directly wrestle with how to overcome it?
I think, again, for me, the answer is pretty similar to the last one of having a community and having practices I do to renew my faith and my spirit. And, for me, that involves going to nature a lot, spending some time each day in nature, just being in the natural world, watching, looking, listening, seeing what's going on, having community that I can connect with, that has rituals and has practices to renew our sense of faith and hope and optimism. It's helped. Like the other night, I was with a group of friends watching the debate, and we were doing some magic around it. And by the end of it, all I could say was like, I'm so glad you were here to help me pick up the pieces. This was awful. But then being able to come back the next day and kind of ground and say, okay, right, we don't know what's going to happen, and there's many ways, many forces that seem to be pushing us into that dystopian future. But let us keep our faith and our commitment that we can figure out the right road to go to create a future of greater justice. And maybe this should just help us recommit our energy toward making that future happen.
So, unfortunately, we only have a minute left. Well, thank you very much for your time today, Starhawk. It's been absolutely wonderful going and hearing your talk, and I know it's had a big impact on everybody here.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for organizing the conference and for helping to grow this genre and really promote this very important work.